The empire sits in the shadow of its former glory. The West has been cut off for almost a decade. The lands have been ravaged, and a child sits upon the throne. The young Emperor Tavros II ascended to the throne of Eastern Respa at the age of 3 after the death of his grandfather Tavros I in 479. His succeeding was thanks to his mother, being the sole child of Tavros I. His father, Nexos, came from a group of barbarians, or rather non-Respins, in the southern hinterland of the Phaetolian Peninsula. Generally disliked, these Anthriacs, as they were known, tended to be local bandits and raiders. With Emperor Tavros being only 3 years of age, most of the actual ruling was done by his father and co-emperor, Nexos the Anthriac. At the time of ascension, the empire was riddled with division and plight. The Beskan Peninsula to the north remained severely depopulated and desolate from the harrowing slaughters of the Keshik horde in 471. The collapse and fracturing of the Western Empire had caused an implosion of the former internal trade routes of the empire, coupled with the relentless pirating of the Valons and Akros, and the wealth that once had flown through the prosperous cities of the Eastern Empire had lessened immensely. The catastrophic failure of General Argolos in the invasion of the Valons in 475 had decimated the Respin navy, leaving the waters of the Metaxagus Sea in nigh complete control of the Valons. The state religion of Respa had been Kilnicism for centuries at this point, and while Kilnicism had taken to be the majority throughout the former empire, the state-sanctioned sect of Chaldean Kilnicism had been beset by heretical splinters during the 5th century. While the Western Empire was able to root them out to a great degree, these heresies had taken full control of the societal and political worlds of the southern portion of the Eastern Empire. How Tavros II would have grown to tackle these issues remains unknown, as in the late winter of 481, the child emperor succumbed to an illness, and the position of emperor now lay solely upon the head of Nexos the Anthriac. At the same time, however, General Argolos, the man who only 6 years prior led the Respins to destruction at the hands of the Valons, had been staying in the region of Kusipt to the south. Kusipt was the hotbed for the Keptic heresy, and as Argolos was a proclaimed Keptic himself, he was easily able to sway the populace to his side. The governor of Kusipt, a man by the name of Erastus, was not a heretic, however. As late in Tavros I's life, he replaced the previous governor, who was a Keptic, with Erastus. Argolos was a true Respin by blood and by spirit. He was disgusted at the state of the fractured empire, and his own inability to reconquer Akros from the Valons. But like a true Respin, he refused to let anything stop him. Argolos would often spin his failed invasion of Akros to highlight the veracity and barbarity of the Valons. It helped that many of the merchants who survived the Valon pirating of the sea were quick to verify the monstrosity of the Valons. These speeches were quick to capture the hearts of the Respins of Kusipt. The fact that the current emperor himself was a barbarian was not lost on these crowds. Having been around Respin politics for decades at this point, Argolos had made friends in some other parts of eastern Respa who weren't too keen on Nexus's reign, or really would prefer their friend to be on the throne and them on the receiving end of generous imperial blessings. While Argolos was busy turning the country against him, Nexus was busy actually administrating the empire. Nexus had grand visions of his rule. He dreamed of better integrating the semi-loyal King Narva and Bechia, putting an end to the Valan terror pirating and plundering the coasts of the Metaxagus Sea, and most of all, putting an end to heresy. You see, Nexus was a very devout Chaldean, and had been at Tavros' side when he commenced his crackdowns of the few pagan holdouts in the Empire. But Nexus wanted to go further. He wanted to root out the heresies as the West had successfully done. Reality would greatly hinder these lofty goals, however, due to the issues racking the Empire. It is quite hard to perform any conquest with a depleted treasury, decimated navy, and the destruction of the East's main pool of manpower. Having been taken under Tavros I's wing for well over a decade, Nexos was fairly capable of navigating the imperial political structure, and Nexus was quick to implement sweeping austerity measures across the Eastern Empire in order to make up for the lost revenue, and to fill the treasury to be able to build the navy back up to combat the Valens. These austerity measures weren't popular with the Cenastopol mob, as Nexus revoked the grain grants, which fed much of the urban poor with free grain. The price of grain in of itself had shot up with the collapse of trade and the loss of the once prosperous farms in the Bascan Peninsula. This all leading to the Cenastopol Revolt of 482, wherein the mobs took over the streets of Cenastopol, and general chaos and rioting ensued. The mob were able to trap Nexus inside of the Imperial complex, and the revolt only ended once Nexus acquiesced to the mob and reinstated the grain grants. It wasn't long after this that the governor of Kusipt, Erastus, sent a missive to Emperor Nexos by water, asking for assistance in quelling a massive revolt, and perhaps by providence alone, the messenger's ship was intercepted by a Valan pirating ship, in turn, allowing more time for the revolt to sweep across Kusipt. This revolt was not a headless mob, however, as it was mainly fought by the armies under Argolos. Argolos was clearly making a play at the throne. Kusipt was the breadbasket of the once unified empire, and now especially the east. Given the necessity for grains, Nexos would have to leave the heavily fortified capital city of Cenastopol for the flat deserts and farmlands of Kusipt in order to maintain stability, a land Nexos was unfamiliar with, and which Argolos had been training in. By the time Nexos began traversing his way into Kusipt, his armies were harassed by Argolos's revolters turned desert skirmishers. Undeterred, Nexos and his men marched on for the port city of Raquette, wherein Nexos took the city with suspicious ease. It wasn't until Nexos and his men had entered the city that Argolos's armies had shown themselves, only they were surrounding Raquette, not inside the city walls. Raquette sat within a slight island amidst the delta, and so there weren't any easy ways of exiting the city, only a handful of easily defensible bridges. Nexus had been tricked, and there was no way of holding out in a siege. Argolos had made sure any siege would be quick. Seeing no other option, Nexus rallied his men, and the Battle of Five Bridges commenced. The fighting was fierce from both sides, but there was never really a chance for Nexos to win this battle. So Nexos focused his efforts on his personal escape. While four of the bridges were steeped in close quarters combat, Nexos and all of his cavalry charged ahead through the fifth bridge, maybe to add some degree of valor to what he was doing. Nexos headed the charge. The pure elan of the charge was enough to temporarily stun the opposing army, and Nexos and his cavalry successfully charged their way out of Raquette. The rest of Nexos's army felt a moment of emboldenment before it began to shrink as the sight of Nexos did in the horizon. Having been abandoned by their own emperor, the remaining forces in Raquette surrendered some time afterwards. Argolos had all but won this war. All he needed to do was place himself upon the throne. But first, he celebrated his victory in Raquette. These celebrations gave Nexos and his cavalry more than enough time to flee back north into the Anthrac homelands, where he was able to recruit a significant force, and he continued on to Cenastopol. Once Nexos arrived, he quickly put his new recruits to work, training them to defend the city during the oncoming siege. And the siege did come. After Argolos had celebrated his victory in Raquette, he marched straight for the capital. Nexos and his Anthrax were ready to hold out for as long as possible, but the people of Cenastopol were not so ready. Either out of mockery for the revolt a year prior or genuine strategy, Argolos began catapulting packages of grain into the city and making sure to assign them Argolos, the Respin. His strategy was clear: let the city fall from the inside out. It only took a couple of weeks for the mob to do its thing, as many of the Anthrax would go around confiscating these grain drops for themselves, and overall treated the Respins there poorly. The streets fell completely out of Nexus's hands after only a few days. He would close himself off in the Imperial complex while his men maintained the walls of the city. This awkward state of affairs would go on for a series of years, however. with Argolos nor the mob being able to breach the defenses of the city. The city would eventually fall with the surrender of the Anthrax in 485. Argolos entered the imperial chambers to see Nexos and his wife lifeless in each other's embrace. It is believed that once his men surrendered, Nexos and his wife took poison. To what lengths Nexos would have been able to reach his goals of saving Eastern Respa will never be known, as now a new man wears the purple, a man who would go down as Argolos the Heretic.